Rolling in though, 296.
I'm at 307, Beth.
Oh, you?
I'm ahead of you.
Yeah.
Hard to believe, Jim.
Must be that Verizon Fios up here in Alexandria.
There you go. Okay.
All right. Well, I think it's a good time to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to close my chat window. Thanks for everyone for taking a moment to introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from. It's very exciting to know that this program is reaching people well beyond our region. So I will go ahead and get started. Carolyn, if you want to hit record. And just let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded today. And we will post the recording on Blue Ridge Prism's YouTube channel. And we'll send links out for that later after the meeting. All right, so welcome. My name is Beth Mizell, and I am the program director for Blue Ridge Prism. We're glad that you're here today. I am joined by Carolyn Politis and Rod Walker and Tim Maywalt, and they will be helping me to host this meeting today. We have quite a turnout, and so we're going to need all hands on deck to manage all your questions. So today we're pleased to host a panel of 5 invasive control experts to answer all of your questions related to controlling and managing invasive plant species during the winter season. So thank you to our panelists and to you and the audience for joining us this afternoon. And we'll introduce all of the panelists when we get to that part of the meeting. So a few things before we get started. Some reminders for all of you. First, we recently opened our registration for the Spring Invasive Species Workshop. Those workshop dates are the 19th, the 27th, and the 31st of March, with each being about 3 hours in length. And it's $10 to participate. Registration is through our website, blueridgeprism.org. We also recently published our winter newsletter, which features an article for winter weed control. If you're not on our email list, you can be added to our website for future PRISM updates and invasive species information. So you can go to our website and sign up there. And then lastly, I wanted to let you know that after the meeting, we will be sending some follow-up information to you in an email with helpful invasive control information and native plant resources. And for our newsletter, it's blueridgeprism.org/news to find that newsletter. So I'll take a moment to go through our agenda for today. As our meeting will go to about 4 o'clock today. So we'll do a few things. We'll start off with an audience poll, which we'll do here in a little bit. And then we'll get a PRISM update from Rod Walker, our president. Then we'll have our invasives control and management expert panel, where we will look at the topics of control methods and herbicides. We'll take a break at 2:30, come back at 2:45, and then we'll resume our expert panel Q&A, and we'll talk more specifically about invasive plants to treat, and also a little bit about restoration. And then we'll do some closing remarks. And we also have an exit survey for each of you, because we want you to rate this event and tell us how we can best serve you. So a few things about Zoom. Most of us are well versed in Zoom at this point. We've all been using it since about March of last year. But just a few tips and tricks. I mentioned the chat box, and you could use the chat to introduce yourself, which you've already done. You can ask questions about how to use Zoom or talk to another attendee through a personal message. So the chat box is more about the process and the meeting. The second thing that you can do is to do the Q&A, which is to the right, and you can ask your specific questions there. So if you have a question for our panelists today, that's where you will ask the question. in the Q&A. So try to not put questions in the chat box. It's just a lot for us to manage both areas. And then we also will have the option to raise your hand. We have a lot of people on the call today, and we expect a lot of excellent questions. And we will try to have 1 or 2 questions per topic where someone can raise their hand, and then you will be unmuted, and then you can ask your question live of the panelist. And like I said, we'll try to do 1 or 2 per topic. So we have plenty of time for questions, but unfortunately we can't get to everyone. And I just wanted to remind you that anytime that you have a question, you can email us at info@blueridgeprism.org, or you can find us on Facebook and pose a question there. And then also at the break, we're going to post all of the email addresses for all of the panelists. So if you have a specific question that you would like to follow up with the panelists, you can do so. And I'll post that at the break. And just a reminder that we're recording this meeting and it will be made available on YouTube. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. So I'll let Carolyn do that. And then we'll take a few minutes to review some of the answers that you gave. So you should see the poll. If you could take a minute to answer some of the questions. Oh, we're starting to see some answers come in. Yeah. So it looks like, Carolyn, I don't know if we have an answer to this question. The poll won't let an individual submit. Nothing happens. It's in the chat box. Yes, and another person also is having this difficulty.
Yeah, I can see that the poll is running smoothly at my end, and maybe it's just a case you have to give it a couple of minutes. Everyone's trying to input at once.
Yeah, okay.
I'm showing
Well,
about 300 people, and close to 300 people have voted so far.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like be sure to scroll down all the way to the bottom before you can see the submit button, if that's a helpful tip for some people. And if not, you know, we appreciate you trying. And definitely please answer the survey after today's meeting. So thank you for everyone for answering these poll questions. We have about 81%. I'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and we'll just do a quick review. It looks like the majority of our audience is based in the Piedmont. Alrighty, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and then we'll give it a quick review. I'm going to share the results. So I think everyone can see the poll. So yeah, it looks like most of our attendees, about half, are based out of the Piedmont. They live or manage land in the Piedmont. 24% of us are located in the Blue Ridge Mountains. 46 people are outside of Virginia. And what size property? About half of half of you are managing, caring for less than 5 acres. What type of property or area do you own or manage? So 59% are working in rural or forested areas. And we have the rest are urban and suburban properties. And then what topic are you most interested in learning about today? And this is the one I suspected everyone would answer. Specific invasive plants, which are best for winter control and how? So we had 52% of the audience answer that question. So, and we actually did budget a larger amount of time to answer those specific questions about specific plants. And then our last question, what organizations have you used to help with invasive plant questions and control? And most of you do all the work yourself. So right on. It's tough. I've been doing this work my whole career and it's a lot. So we all have that commonality. It looks like about 12% work with private consultants and contractors. 21% of you have worked with the Virginia Department of Forestry. And then we have folks that also have worked with Blue Ridge Prism and the Native Plant Society to get information. So this is great. Thank you everyone for taking the time to help us understand our audience better. Somebody, yep, Virginia Master Naturalist. We should put that on the poll as well. Thank you for pointing that out, Patricia. So, all right, so we're gonna close out of that poll. And at this point, I'm gonna turn the meeting over to Rod Walker to give us a PRISM update. And I'll introduce Rod. Rod Walker is the founder and now president of Blue Ridge Prism, and he will give us an update on PRISM's latest activities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rod.
Thank you, Beth. Now let me see if I can get this to work right. There we go.
Yeah, I can see.
Well, welcome everybody, it should be a fun afternoon, and I always learn something when we do these as well. So first, let me add my thanks to Beth for moderating this session. As you know, she's our program director. She joined the PRISM last fall. We were thrilled to find somebody with all the skills she brings to the table, as well as experience working with 2 other cooperative weed management areas, one in Florida and one in Indiana. So again, welcome Beth, and I'm sure you'll all hear from her frequently and often as time goes on. So let me launch into what I have here today to talk about. And first, let me just say, I hope you're all healthy and finding lots of time to spend outdoors. Obviously, the plants are moving along at the same speed they always have, regardless of pandemics. And you'll find here that in this discussion that winter is a great time to get a lot done. A lot of people think it's the quiet time of year when you just wait for spring, and the answer is, it's not the time to just sit and wait. I mean, there are a lot of advantages. I mean, there's no bugs, there's no snakes. It's easier to find things. It's easy to get through the woods. There's less risk of doing damage to some of the native plants. And oh, by the way, the work keeps you warm and you're socially distanced. So it's a good thing. So I'm going to talk really briefly today and cover, what's the status of the PRISM becoming its own 501c3, our fundraising, our current activities, and then field any questions if there are any about the status of the PRISM. So in terms of our 501c3 status, some of you may be aware that up until this point, we had operated under the umbrella of the Shenandoah National Park Trust, a wonderful organization. They helped us over the last 6 years to get to where we are, but we finally incorporated the Blue Ridge Prism Inc. As of August 4th of last year. And we are now pretty much all set up and operating as Blue Ridge Prism Inc. The last big item was getting our 501c3 determination letter from the IRS, which we literally just got a week or 2 ago. So now we're official, and that means donations can now be made directly to the Blue Ridge Prism or Blue Ridge Prism Inc. Instead of passing through the Shenandoah National Park Trust. We still have a couple of our grant programs that pass through the trust that we've signed years ago. Some of those will be transferring over to the Blue Ridge Prism. Others, like our NRCS RCPP program, we're just going to let them run out, under the name of the trust. The RCPP program is due to expire at the end of September. So in terms of operations, really, becoming our own 501c3 really doesn't change anything that we're really doing. The mission and the activities are the same. We've got the same leadership team, 13 volunteers, 2 employees. Half a dozen people do most of the work, but everybody chips in. We're forming a formal board of directors. We've got some officers. The organization that used to be our steering committee has been transformed now into an advisory council. And again, Beth is our full-time program director, and Carolyn Politis is part-time, helping us out. 2 wonderful people. And it's still a volunteer, landowner-driven organization. In terms of fundraising, we are 100% funded. Our operations are 100% funded by grants and donations. And most of it comes through 2 matching grants, one from the Virginia Environmental Endowment and another one from a family foundation. Each of those 2 organizations gives us $20,000 if we can match it with donations from people like you. So we did the Family Foundation grant match during Q4, and that worked out really well. And with the Virginia Environmental Endowment, hopefully we'll get a renewal of our grant in early April. And at that time, you may hear from us as we seek to match that one to keep us going financially. Landowner Activities, a couple of quick summaries from 2020. No surprise, we had a lot fewer events in 2020 than we had the year before, because we weren't tabling at other people's events. All of those were basically shut down. But the overall attendance across all our events was roughly the same, even though I think we were less than half the number of events. We had our 4 quarterly meetings. We did 1 tabling event before all the rest of them were canceled. We had 10 speaking engagements that started up again after various groups, garden clubs and whatnot, got used to using Zoom. And we quickly rekindled our workshops, did 7 out of the 9, in the course of the year, and we'll be doing the full 9 this year, a lot more, with the next ones coming up this March. So you can look at our website to see the schedule for our workshops. We are still publishing our quarterly newsletters. Carolyn and company do a wonderful job with that. And clearly there's lots of Prism materials available on our website. All in all, in 2020, we had over 1,100 attendees at our events, which was a great result given all the difficulties that we all encountered last year. Landowner Financing, we're finishing up the NRCS RCPP program. That'll be finished at the end of September of this year. We just finished the 3rd year of work with our 5-year DuPont settlement grant for treating 6 wavy leaf sites. And we did the 1st year of a $45,000 grant from the Department of Forestry for treating some additional wavy leaf sites. On our email list, we're now up to almost 2,000 people, up from 1,300 last January. So it's been a busy year and a great year. And if the turnout continues like it is today, those numbers are going to get a lot bigger. So that's wonderful. Some other key activities on a statewide basis. It's been slow, but now we're starting to re-engage with various organizations in Richmond, including the 2 secretariats, Natural Resources and Agriculture and Forestry. And we'll be restarting and continuing our conversations with VDOT, the Department of Wildlife Resources, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Department of Forestry, Agriculture and Consumer Services, and perhaps go back and revisit with First Lady Pamela Northam. A couple of things to note in particular. We have a study that we're working with VDOT on that's kicking off this month. And this is a study to go out and inventory both the native and the non-native plants on hundreds of roadside sites throughout the state. Virginia Tech is doing the work, and they will come back with recommendations saying, hey, here's what we found, here's what's growing, and here's the native plants that they should consider incorporating into their best practices, depending upon the nature of the individual sites. Another item that's active right now is in Richmond, and there's legislation being dealt with that would ask the state to study the options to slow down, if presumably eradicate or stop the sale of invasive plants in the state of Virginia. And so we're looking for everybody to write their state senators and voice support for it's the bill HJ 527, which as of today, I believe, is now in the Senate Rules Committee. It's been through the House, went through crossover, and is now being looked at by the Senate. So we got great support in the House. We now need to make sure we get the same support in the Senate to get that pushed through. Likewise, we are actively working on adding more plants to the Virginia noxious weeds list. Last July, we got 6 plants added. We're in the process of creating the next round of nominations to be reviewed in March. Hopefully we'll have a bigger batch to go through this time. And if anybody's interested in participating, it's tricky, complicated work, but there's always room for more people to help nominate more plants. One other item, we do have a drone project underway with UVA, wherein a PhD student is looking to prove that we can use a drone with very sophisticated hyperspectral imagery to fly over a large area and produce a map of specific plants. And that's all based on the spectral signature and how the light reflected from different plants is different depending upon the species. So, and if any of you are out there interested in forming a prism, we are eager to help other groups form prisms in other parts of the state. So we'll be happy to have a conversation with any of you about how to do that and get that started. A couple of other miscellaneous things people can do to help in this process. Again, send emails to the senators. You can see our website for that. Understand what you have on your property, how to deal with it. Help your neighbors understand what they've got, and then work together. It's a lot better to do this as groups and with contiguous landowners. If you find some really uncommon invasive plants, record those in the phone apps that are available, Maiden or EDD maps. Feel free to work with us on the noxious weeds list and help various other groups with public parks. If you've got a group that you want a speaker for, let us know. And again, we'll help you form a prism if that's of interest. So here's the reminders. You can write your state senator regarding the bill that's pending. We do have workshops in March if you're interested in signing up. Donations are always welcomed. Questions are always welcomed, as well as any speakers for your group. So with that, Beth and Tim, are there any questions for this section before we move on to the panel?
Rod, we did have a couple. We had the first comment from Mike Winger, bodacious beard, Rod.
Love it.
We also had a congratulations on our 501c3 status. That was, we're very excited about that happening. So thank you very much for that comment.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, and then we did have one question about, and Carolyn did answer in the chat. Someone wanted to know, how do we join Prism? And Carolyn replied, Prism's open to everyone and we do not charge a fee or membership. And we operate on donations and volunteers. And if you'd like to volunteer, you can email us at info@blueridgeprism.org. And if you want to sign up to get email notices and alerts about events like this and when to treat certain plants and general invasives information, you can go to our website and sign up to get on our email list there, blueridgeprism.org. And I think that was that was all that we had.
Sounds great.
Let me mention, Rod, there are a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A, but I think they're ones that are going to get covered by the panelists. One's on the most efficient way to deal with Pachysandra. Another is relative to dealing with poison ivy. So I think we'll be addressing those. The third question was, is autumn olive considered an invasive species? And yes, indeed it is.
Mhm.
So those are the three questions that I expect we'll be dealing with.
Sounds good.
And we also had another question from Anne, who is asking if is Prism just for Virginia? Is it in other states? Would you like to answer that, Rod?
Yeah, so the PRISM generically is what's known as a cooperative weed management area. There are actually several hundred cooperative weed management areas across the United States. We were the first one to be formed in Virginia. So it really depends on what state you're in. There may or may not be one that covers your area. The bulk of them are out west, but it varies a great deal from state to state. As Beth knows, the entire state of Florida, for example, is covered by cooperative weed management areas. So yeah, if you send us information on where you are, we can let you know anything we know about what's happening in your state.
Okay, thank you, Rod. All right, with that, I think we have all the questions that we can answer at this time. So we'll move on to the part of the meeting that everyone came for, the meat and potatoes of invasives control in the winter. So with that, I'll ask all of our panelists to go ahead and restart your video. And let me change how I can see you. Okay. So today, what we'll do is we'll start out with introductions for each of the panelists, and I'll give each of the panelists a few minutes to share more about who you are and your background and your experience in managing invasive plants, and then we'll begin the discussion and start taking questions from people. And I'll remind the audience that if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom. You can see the little Q&A with the little bubbles at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to get to those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start the introductions, and we'll start with Nicola McGoff. And she is the director and professional wetland scientist and with Wild Ginger Field Services. And Nicola, would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me all fine.
Yes.
Okay. So I run Wild Ginger Field Services. I started that about 10 or 11 years ago. It's a small business based near Charlottesville, so covers most of Virginia. I am an ecologist by training with a real soft spot for wet ecosystems. I work in dry ones as well, but I like the wet places. I'm a part-time sort of botanist, better as an ecologist, seeing the whole landscape and the community and how it works together. I dabble in land stewardship, and so invasive species control is kind of overlaid in all of those areas. I work in tiny little sites up to sort of 1,000-acre sites. So the scale is very much just depends on the site and what the problem is. And I try and think of invasive control as one of the tools in landscape restoration. We're trying to get ecosystem balance back, as opposed to just thinking you're going to obliterate the invasive species, because that would be kind of heartbreaking if that's what you thought you were going to achieve. Because really they're quite tenacious and they just keep coming. So it's nice if you can think of it as trying to move towards balance and trying to get stuff back the way it's supposed to be. And that's it. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. You would think I would learn to unmute myself right now. Next, we'll go to Jim Hurley. Jim is on Prism's leadership team. He's a master naturalist and a landowner who loves to kill invasive plants. Jim,
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Beth. I am broadcasting here from Alexandria, where I drove up here yesterday from our 156-acre property in Greene County, just up above Charlottesville in Virginia, to take advantage of Verizon Fios here, which we have here, but not down in Greene, which internet is extremely tenuous. So I began up here in Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, about 20 years or so ago, doing invasive species control on private property, and then as a volunteer in public parks with master naturalists for 5 or more years. Sort of cut my teeth on invasive plant ID and control, working along with some contractors used by Arlington County to learn about herbicides and invasives control. We bought a property down in Greene County in 2013, 2014. And I expected to go down there to, working on this 156-acre property and be slogging away on my own, but was delighted to find that introduced by Brian Morse, who's also on this panel, to the Blue Ridge Prism, which was just getting started at the time, so that I found an organization that would help support my work, not just on my property, but also facilitate impact regionally as well as statewide. So I've been slogging away on a whole array of invasive species on our property, getting projects going around Greene County, working with the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, for example, and private landowners in the area, working particularly on what we call EDRR species, early detection, rapid response species in the area, like lesser celandine, wavy leaf, kudzu, and others that are in relatively small numbers, and sort of marshaling efforts to get control efforts going on those types of plants before they take off and become even huger problems than they are now. So just a little bit about my experience, and delighted to be with you all today, and turn it back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for joining us today. Next, we're going to go to Brian Morse. He's a principal wildlife biologist at Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group. Brian, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Beth. That said, I'm Brian Morse. I'm the principal with Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group. We're a private consulting and contracting company based in Albemarle County, just outside of Charlottesville. And I'm thrilled to be back on this panel, and delighted to see it grow to such a huge number from the past. So it's good that there's so many people engaged in making our ecosystems a little bit better. So our company has been around for a little over 10 years, and we do a lot of natural resource management, consulting and contracting work, kind of anything outside. We dabble in a lot of traditional forest management, wildlife habitat establishment, ecosystem restoration, some wetlands work. And over the years, we have really grown the invasive species side of things. That seems to be a tremendous demand, as we're seeing with the turnout here today. And so we do a variety of invasive species management all throughout the year, and it seems that every year we add a new species to that list that I learn, unfortunately, in some circumstances. And so thrilled to be here today, and hopefully we can answer everybody's questions.
Great, thank you, Brian. And now we'll go to Joe Rossetti. He is a senior area forester with the Virginia Department of Forestry. He covers Culpeper, Fauquier, Green, Madison, Orange, and Rappahannock.
Yeah, thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Really appreciate being with you guys here today. As Beth said, I'm a senior area forester with the Virginia Department of Forestry. I've been with the department for 16 years, mostly up in this neck of the woods, working out of Warrenton. I've also worked in Loudoun and Prince William, Fairfax counties. I started out in Southeast Virginia, southeast of Richmond. And before coming here, I worked for a consulting forester out of West Virginia. But really enjoy my time here with the Department of Forestry. If you haven't taken the opportunity yet to contact your local forester, I strongly encourage you to. Definitely in Virginia, we have a really good staff of folks that can help you on your property. The beginning part of working with us is you don't have to pay for at the time. We appreciate that you've paid your taxes, and so it's really already paid for. And you can get a good bit of advice from us for free to get you started off. Our staff works mostly with forest invasives, so we're really well versed in those, especially the woody ones, but a lot of the herbaceous plants you find in forests. I keep on learning more and more about invasives in fields from Brian and from our friends at the NRCS and the soil and water districts, but our staff really specializes in forest habitats. And one thing that our staff is also really good at is helping you, in addition to identify them, prioritize how to attack them and how that invasive species control can fit into the overall management of your forest land, and try to bring some of the programs down to an understandable level sometimes, and help you work through that and plan your way through it. So if you haven't reached out to us yet, you're welcome to. If you don't know who your local forester is or how to get them, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'll help you find them.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I encourage everyone, if you haven't worked with the Department of Forestry, to reach out. They have a great resource page on their website that can tell you who your local forester is too, based on county. I think I've used it. That's actually how I found Joe, to get in touch with him. So yes, okay. And our last panelist is William Hamersky, and he is on our PRISM leadership team. He's also a master naturalist involved with Charlottesville area tree stewards and a private landowner. William, will you tell us about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Beth, and welcome everybody. I'm seeing almost 400 people is pretty phenomenal, and that's I'm all giddy about having so many people watching and listening and needing the information that we've garnered over these so many years. I'm relatively recent to Virginia. I've been here about 6 years. We've got 13 acres just west of Charlottesville, and when I first got here, well, coming from California, all the plants are different. And I thought some of these things were okay plants, but then realized that no, most of the plants that we had in my forest were invasives, Multiflora Rose, autumn olive. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. Well, anyway, it's taken me 5 or so years, and I've eliminated most of the large, I should say, individuals on the property. Now it's just going out there periodically cleaning up, all the resprouts and the new seedlings and all that. But what the point that I'm trying to make is there is hope. You can do this. It might take a long time, but it's really worth it to see, your native flora come back. So that's my deal.
Thank you, William. All right, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. And I was going to just kick off our discussion. We have some questions already, and we will get to your questions. But I was going to kick off the discussion with a question for the panel. And I just want to remind you that we'll take questions throughout the discussion and try to answer as many as possible. And we are going to move through several relevant topics today, including control techniques, herbicides, particular species for winter control, and restoration. So I'll kick off the question, and I was actually going to toss this question to Brian first, to give us your thoughts on how effective dormant season treatments are versus treatments during the growing season, and what are some of the benefits of doing control work in the dormant season?
Sure. Well, on the question of efficacy, of course, like almost everything else in the natural world, it depends. And there's pros and cons and trade-offs to when and where and how a lot of this type of invasive species work is done. So for a lot of woody plants or plants that are tardily deciduous or evergreen, you can have a lot of success. But a lot of it is dependent on the climate and weather. So if we have a really early spring and things start greening up more quickly, you kind of have to truncate your management efforts, and sometimes you can extend that a little bit longer. So, but on the whole, a lot of the treatments that we're going to discuss today can be quite effective and much more pleasant to work in, which moves into kind of the next part of your question, the advantages of doing some of this invasive work in the winter, even when some of the plants are sleeping. Some of these topics have already been alluded to: the ease of access, the ease of visibility, the more comfortable working conditions. All of these things can increase speed as well as durability. Someone treating can last a lot longer than a 90-degree day in the middle of the summer with the bugs biting. So there's a lot of great things that can happen in the winter, and one that may not get talked about a lot, but is planning and mapping and spending time working with folks like the Department of Forestry and the Prism to kind of get yourself ready and in gear for the year, so that you don't find all of a sudden things are going to seed and you miss the boat. So that's another great thing to do in the winter.
Okay. Anyone else have some thoughts on this question? Anything to add, Nicola?
Yeah, just that I find sometimes I get used to treating in the growing season, and there's a pretty rapid response in the vegetation in the summer, and that it's much slower, the response in the winter and dormant season. So just to caution you that if you treat something and you don't see any ill effect for a couple of weeks, just remember they're all the plants are moving at half speed. So give it a bit of extra time to see if you get the mortality that you're aiming for.
Yes, be patient. Be patient.
Just another quick comment, Beth.
Yeah.
And that would be the efficacy of treating these tardily dormant plants. If you're using a foliar application of herbicide, the ability to treat the target plant and not hit non-target native plants that you don't want to kill. Much easier to do that in the winter when the deciduous plants, whether they're annuals or perennials, when they've disappeared underground. And so I first learned that trick working with invasive plant control in Arlington parks, when there was a tremendous amount of English ivy and vinca in Barcroft Park in particular. And we decided to put the timing, we began the treatment of that park in the spring and went all the way through the summer, but delayed on English ivy and vinca, et cetera, treatment until November, December, when everything else was below ground and would not be hit or touched by the herbicide.
And William.
Yeah, one caveat about poison ivy, because someone mentioned more information on poison ivy. It doesn't look like poison ivy because there's no leaves on it. So just be careful about vines climbing trees in the winter. Just throw that one out there.
Yeah.
Because I've been hit in the winter, and it's not fun.
So it's funny, William, because I was gonna put in a comment about vines, that I love treating vines in the winter because it's so much easier to see. Like the forest in the summer gets a bit suffocating and overwhelming to try and even see what you've worked on or where you've been. So in the winter, it's great to walk in, whether that's a tiny patch or the edge of your forest, and just go tree by tree and cut every vine, including the poison ivy in my world, because my husband gets a big allergic reaction to it. But be careful, like that. You don't know necessarily whether you're cutting poison ivy, so don't wear gloves and try not to touch the blade of your machete. And that's it. I think it's a great time of year for working on vines.
I would also add regarding poison ivy to, after you're done with a day of work, clean your tools with Technu or some other, especially if you're sensitive to poison ivy. I am, and my husband also is terribly sensitive. So yeah, wear gloves, clean your tools, because you may not readily identify a poison ivy vine from another.
Beth, another comment here, inspired by Nicola's and William's comments. This is primarily to Brian, although Nicola, you might have some experience with this, and that is on kudzu. I wonder, kudzu is generally treated in a two-stage process, as I understand it and have experienced it. Cutting the climbing vines, then going back, and this usually during August, September timeframe, going back and spraying whatever is green on the ground. Would you consider cutting the climbing vines in the winter and doing that stage first, and then coming back in the summer and completing the job with an herbicide spray on the ground vines?
Yes. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, I think we both probably have the same thing to say, which is absolutely cut it in the winter. Like that, it's so much easier to see it and enjoy your day out in the forest. I would say that kudzu is a really fast growing species in the hot months, and especially the hottest months when we tend to not really want to work. So make sure if you're cutting a kudzu, make two cuts, so one towards the ground and one at about 5 or 6 feet tall, just so as the new tendrils, if you miss them, doesn't grab a hold of the old vine and just race back up the tree. So cut yourself a big break in any of those vines.
And I'll add specifically to kudzu. Nicola's point about doing a window cut really helps visualize where you've been and where you haven't, and then doesn't allow those tendrils to come back so quickly. That's a great point. Specifically on kudzu, especially in our region, kudzu is pretty sensitive to cold weather and frost. And so the really small vines can be completely knocked back by a frost and are just dead. So in the winter, look for the larger vines, 2, 3, 4 inch diameter. And the color of that age and size of a kudzu vine is almost black. They're really dark. Those will be the ones that are probably still active, and you can do something like a cut stump treatment. Whereas a lot of the other teeny tiny vines are probably just junk. You just need to cut through and get out of your way. And I'm seeing a lot of comments come out of the poison ivy and vine questions down here in the chat. And another good thing to do is to make sure that your wintertime plant ID skills are up to snuff. And for those botany geeks out there, it's a great time to challenge yourself when the leaves are off, to have to identify by the bark or the buds or some other characteristic when the leaves are gone, so that you're actually treating autumn olive and not spice bush and Oriental bittersweet and not trumpet creeper or something. So it's a good opportunity to brush up on your wintertime ID skills as well.
Can I speak here? So I'm only looking every now and again to see some of the messages popping up at the bottom. So I'm sure I'm not seeing all of them, as there's so many of us on here. But absolutely, poison ivy and Virginia creeper are worth keeping. They're wonderful native plants. I don't have anything against them. They support amazing pollinators and bird life, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the sites that I work on, they have a problem with vines, and a lot of the vines commingle. So instead of spending time trying to figure out if 1 or 2 of the vines are worth keeping, generally as a work practice, we just cut all the vines, because it's a better way to ensure that you've gotten the problem under control. If I came across just 1 poison ivy or 1 Virginia creeper by itself, it would just be left. But so some of my comments, they're based on problem sites that I have in mind.
Okay, great.
Also, all of this, we've mentioned a few times, a lot of these things are landowner specific, and some landowners are super sensitive to poison ivy. And so even though it's a native plant, they want to control it because it's a problem for them. Otherwise, I agree with Nicola and Brian and Jim. Those are, that and Virginia creeper are not things we need to get out of the woods. And I go so far, same with grapevine. We don't need to get that out of the woods on a broad scale. It's again, site specific landowner management sort of discussion. I do want to make a comment too on something Brian mentioned. about treating in the winter time and the timing of that, and exactly when winter treatment season ends exactly. As soon as these plants start growing, or even really before they start visibly growing in the spring, our winter treatment season has ended already, where you can really effectively cut the woody plants and herbicide the stump and have the stump die and not have it already started to grow. So in most years, I seem to see that as happening around second half of February, when that winter treatment season is pretty much over, for woody plants at least. I'm thinking this year that might happen even earlier, as we've had a warmish winter so far. So I'm curious what the other panelists' thoughts are on that. I usually tell landowners that that season to do cut stump treatments on Tree of Heaven and Autumn Olive is pretty much over about February 15th. Would you guys agree with that?
I just jump in here to say that we should be clear that we're really talking about herbicide applications here, and not mechanical applications. So feel free to keep on yanking up that honeysuckle and yanking up the wineberry and other shrubs that are small enough to pull straight out of the ground. You can continue to do that beyond Joe's mid-February or so timeframe. But we're really talking there about the efficacy, and Joe's addressing the efficacy of herbicides and their ability to be translocated down into the root system, which is impeded by the sap flowing up from the root system when the plants are starting to come out of dormancy and going into their growth, leaf out growth phase. But keep on doing the work mechanically if you got the energy and the strong back to do it.
William, did you have something to?
Yeah, two things. One, we hit 400 participants, but now we're down. But we hit 400. Just want to throw that number out. And secondly, getting back to poison ivy. I mean, once they're up in the tree, that's one thing. But if you've got a lot of new sprouts on the ground and you've got dogs and your dogs run through your woods, just they'll bring it back. They'll bring it back with them, and you'll wonder, would I get poison ivy on my wrists here? I wasn't even out. So that's another reason that I hit poison ivy on my property wherever I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's highly specific to the individual and the goals. Nicola?
Just back to Joe's comment that often when I think of winter treatment, I think of more my access to the woods as opposed to what the plants are doing, so it was funny to hear you talk about it from a kind of plant phenology standpoint. I just think of like, it's nice and cold and I can walk in the woods and see a long way, and therefore it's winter, right? Or early spring. So it's a good point that we should consider the treatment with the sap flow of the trees, whether it's going up or down. In the spring, they're leafing out, so everything is going up. But there is a nice period in the summer and then into the fall when you can still do cut stump or hack and squirt on trees, and they start translocating into the roots. So there is kind of just a window in spring where we should pause those treatments. But
okay, so at this point, I think it would be a good time to, William, I'll give you one more point and then we'll move on. Go ahead.
I don't know if all of our audience knows what cut stump is, what hack and squirt is. Is that where you're going? Is that where you're going, Beth?
That's where we're going.
Okay, good.
Thank you. So this is a good time to move the conversation into specific control techniques. We've touched on a lot of different ways. We've talked about mechanical treatments, cut stump. So I wanted to ask you to discuss tips for treatment using different techniques during the dormant season. I think this would be a good point for us to take a few questions from Tim and Rod. There's a lot of open questions, and there were a few about winter ID and window cut. So Rod and Tim, can you come on and give us some questions for the panel?
There's just lots of good questions out here, like timing and control of lesser celandine.
Okay.
Glyphosate has not worked well for me. What do I do?
Well, can we actually talk about that during the this particular species for winter control? I think that might be a more appropriate time.
I have a more timely question for Nicola.
Okay, go ahead.
What is Nicola knitting? Does it contain a plant motif?
It is the very beginning of a hat. And I kept forgetting to keep it out of my screen so you wouldn't know what I was doing. But thanks for asking.
If I weren't,
On that lesser selenine question, Beth, just make sure you note that one, make sure we get back to it. 'Cause and I have a lot of experience with lesser selenine. Want to let the questioner know that.
yeah, we'll make a point to come back to that.
There are also
Brian.
numerous questions all around bamboo.
Okay, we'll do that one later. So here's one about, well, so there was one about window cut, and I think that was mentioned when we were talking about vines. Would somebody like to explain more about what window cut is, the concept behind it?
Brian, you
Yeah,
used the term.
I think Brian used the term.
Go for
So
it.
this is basically a two-cut process where you cut the vine low to the ground, you can treat the stump, and then you cut it maybe at chest or head height. So it is two cuts, but it allows for a much more dramatic visual when you're going through a very large vine infestation. You can really understand and see where you've been, especially if you have to come back multiple days. The other advantage to that, which was more in the growing season that Nicola was mentioning, was that for rapidly growing species like kudzu, or even if you're working on the project yourself and you're not able to get back to it in a timely fashion for one reason or another, regrowth from the stump or new seedlings that emerge aren't able to just pop up and automatically grab a tendril hold of that dead vine that's hanging and just have another ladder to go up. It'd be nice to have a visual here in front of us, but I guess that's harder to do with the Zoom.
So yeah, this is a good point to mention our PRISM workshops, in particular, where we cover these treatment methods in a fair amount of detail with lots of visuals and slides and photos of things like that. So we already did a set of winter workshops back in October, November. Our next set will be coming up at the end of March. We'll focus on spraying on plants that can be treated in spring. I do want to not take anything for granted as well. Brian used the term treat the cut stump and what that means. And that means using a concentrated herbicide, and that would probably be a 25% glyphosate or a Triclopia product with a spray bottle and squirting that directly on the stump that has been cut, the part that is going into the ground, on that fresh cut before it has a chance to heal itself and seal itself up. And a little dab of herbicide or a squirt of herbicide goes on that cut, and what we're hoping for is that gets pulled down into the root system and kills the plant dead down in the root system.
And that second cut takes only seconds. So there's hardly any time that you've wasted, if you will, on that second cut, and makes it so much easier when you come back 6 months, a year later, and I don't have to go over to that tree because I can see there are no vines growing yet.
Yeah. Is there ever a time where it's beneficial to paint both surfaces of the cut with herbicides? So the cut going, the vine going into the ground and the one to the top of the tree. There's no benefit to that?
Well,
Nicola?
so if you can put a herbicide on the cut that's closest to the ground, that is the most beneficial because it is generally they're systemic herbicides and they will be affecting the root mass that's below the ground. That's the aim, so it doesn't resprout. I have tried to spray on the uppercut, and there's a couple of problems with it. One, it's generally chest or head high, so it's not the safest practice to be spraying any chemical or even vinegar, at that kind of height. It's not. It's just not very smart. Also, generally, when you cut vines, they have a lot of fluid that comes out of them. So it's a thing of folly where you're trying to spray a liquid on a cut stump that's spewing liquid. So that also, it's not necessarily the most effective use of chemicals. So that's my experience with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say you'd have some chance of that herbicide getting on the tree, depending on what it is and what you're using. It could affect the tree. Other herbicides don't that way. So it depends on what you're using. If what's going up, if the side going up clearly goes up into the tree and stays there, I don't see any need to herbicide that. If you're working on vines that are kind of large vines, but going across the ground and they kind of wind back and forth, I've done that and not known which side is going to the root system. So I treat both of them.
Okay. All good points. All right, so I do see a question in the Q&A that talks more about invasives control techniques from Deb, and they ask, is basal bark treatment or hack and squirt better in the winter? So we can offer some of your own experiences, what you prefer, how you prefer to use these techniques, if one's better than the other. Would anybody like to take it?
I can start. So I generally prefer basal bark. I think I just find it easier because then I don't have to cut and spray. I know that sounds a little lazy, but if you're looking at hundreds of trees, it actually makes a difference. I also feel I control my herbicide a bit better when I get used to just basal bark spraying. I have it at the right pressure. I can see the dye. Saying that, if there are larger trees, especially ailanthus, I tend to go with hack and squirt because I found basal bark didn't do it with one treatment. So with smaller trees, I find basal bark is easier and effective, and hack and squirt is better on the larger trees. But Joe and Brian might have more to say on that.
In general, I would agree with that. If you want to use maybe an 8-inch diameter as kind of a ballpark to move away from the basal bark and move more into a hack and squirt, that's kind of a general size that for you to visualize, but it's going to depend a little bit on the species. But the basal bark works really well in the winter with the shrubs and the smaller trees. You can use it in a wide range of environmental gradients. So as long as the bark is dry, you can use it. But the thing to note is that basal bark is a combination of basal oil or a specific carrier along with a oil-based herbicide. I think most of the herbicides that people are used to dealing with are water-based. The water-based will not work well with the basal oil. You need to use an oil base, and the most popular one is Triclopia 4, which is the ester combination of Triclopia. With the hack and squirt, you're going to use a water-based herbicide like Triclopia 3, which is the amine version or formulation of Triclopia, or a glyphosate product. 9 times out of 10, there are other products you can use, but those are really the safest and best ones to use for that. And you would mix that, either mix it at a 50% concentration or straight, depending on the product you're using.
And what about, this might be a question that some people have, what about temperature during the winter? What are some considerations when treating in cold weather? Is there a minimum temperature that using herbicides is effective, water-based or the oil-based herbicides?
The oil-based, you can go below freezing, but obviously with a water-based herbicide at 32 degrees, it's going to start to gum up and ice and jam the nozzles. But for a lot of the practices where you're essentially injecting into the bark or the cambium or the different layers of the woody part of the plant, the temperatures, besides freezing the product you're using, aren't as big of a deal as if you're trying to foliar treat something that's green and actively trying to photosynthesize. So for example, with the basal bark, you could treat, on a 30-degree day, as long as it's nice and sunny and the bark is dry.
Okay.
But for a foliar treatment, the plant has to have leaves that are green, and the temperature has to definitely be over 45 degrees, say preferably around 50 degrees or higher in the winter. So that Japanese honeysuckle is a great candidate for that. I saw a comment about English ivy. That's a good candidate for that in the winter. The plants like English ivy that have real waxy leaves, surfactant helps a lot in the herbicide to help that spread and stick to the leaf with the water-based herbicide. Autumn olive, more late in the fall, early winter, before it loses its leaves, is a pretty good candidate for that. Multiflora rose, if it has its leaves on it, that's another that gets them early, loses them late. But any of those that have their leaves in the winter are candidates for that.
There was a comment about briefly explaining the two techniques. So let me just quickly run through that. The basal bark technique is with a backpack most of the time, and you're going to mix the basal oil with the Triclopia 4, and you're going to really shake that up really well in the backpack or the container you're using. And usually it's a 3-part basal oil to 1 part herbicide. Usually the basal oil is going to come with a dye in it already. And then you're going to spray that onto the bottom 12 to 18 inches, depending on the size of the tree or the shrub, all the way on the bark. You just spray it right on the bark all the way down to the ground line. And if there's any roots sticking up, you can spray it on those as well. But you're going to go all the way around the stem of that individual plant. With the hack and squirt, that's more of taking a hatchet and a squirt bottle and hacking a wound at an angle into the bark of the tree, all the way around it. Though you don't want to completely girdle the tree, you want to leave a little space in between those hacks, and then using a squirt bottle to inject a highly concentrated version of the herbicide directly into that wound. Did that help?
I think so. There were a lot of questions about basal bark, and so thank you. The following up with, Nicola, go ahead.
I had one comment on temperature, that we were covering the cold because it is winter, the cold temperature, but I believe there's some formulations of Triclopia that you shouldn't use when it gets too hot. And just to make sure we mention that caution, that I can't remember what the temperature is. It probably says it on the label because all the information is on the label, but there are some treatments with Triclopia that we should probably avoid for most of August for Virginia weather. So
yeah, very good.
Yes, the Triclopia 4 herbicides you shouldn't use over 85 degrees, or the herbicide can volatilize. 2,4-D herbicides are well known for volatilizing over 85 degrees, and when that happens, the herbicide chemical itself, it's not quite evaporates. It's a little bit different, but ends up in a body of air and can land on anything wherever the air moves. So you definitely want to avoid that over 85.
William?
And just getting the other end of that spectrum, I actually just very carefully read over 2 broadleaf herbicides. They had nothing about the lower limit. So, I mean, because I looked very carefully for temperature stuff, but yeah, the upper limit, for some things, but for cut stump or hack and squirt, as long as the tree is not frozen or the shrub's not frozen, your application right into the bark should be fine almost at any temperature. Right, Brian, would you agree with that?
Yes.
I do have a point here. Numerous questions are dealing with the fact that we're talking a lot about the use of herbicides because it's so routine, and raising questions about the impacts of herbicides. What alternatives are available to herbicides? How can you convince someone who is dead set against using them that you've got a tough row to hoe without using them, and so on?
Tough row to hoe. Year after year after year, you'd be hoeing whatever that shrub or whatever it was, unless you rip out the entire root system, which is just really time consuming and not often completely effective.
Some of that depends on what species you're dealing with and what the scale is. If you're, I have an 1.5 acres. So when I do this on my own property, and half of that's yard. So when I do this in the woods on my property, I can hand pull all the wineberry in there in a couple of days, and and then get back after it next year. It's not a big deal. But if I were doing this over 100 acres, I'm not going to be hand pulling wineberry on 100 acres. So the smaller the size of the property, the more practical that gets. The larger the plant size, the less practical the mechanical treatment is. Yesterday, I saw a 24-inch diameter tree of heaven, and nobody's pulling that root system out of the ground. So that's really that's when the discussion of let's use a cut stump herbicide on this, because otherwise you're going to be cutting tree of heaven sprouts for decades. And the use of, I find with people that are apprehensive about herbicides, which I totally understand, but then talking to them about doing a cut stump treatment instead of a foliar treatment, and how you have so much more control over where the herbicide goes. There's much less potential for it hitting something you don't want it to. We've talked about spraying it and using a spray bottle for that, but I like using a foam paintbrush in a jar of the herbicide personally, especially for small scale things. There are special applicators that are made and can be used with this. One of the pretty active people in Prism showed me one called Buckthorn Buster. It's pretty effective. There's weed wicks that can be used, and kill sticks and things like that. These PVC pipes with a piece of foam on the end to apply herbicide. So that really helps with the potential for the herbicide to go somewhere you don't want it to, at least.
Let me jump in here too on the relationship between herbicide treatment and mechanical on a species that perhaps many of you all on this webinar are dealing with, and that would be Japanese honeysuckle. I used Brian Morse and his crew on our property killing Japanese honeysuckle on the forest floor. It had been climbing up. This is in a pretty much closed canopy situation where you had small vines climbing 10, 15 feet up trees, reaching for sunlight, and then a lot of diffuse honeysuckle on the forest floor, actually more intense than diffuse. And so as a first treatment, this is a strategy that you might consider. As a first treatment, do herbiciding in an October timeframe, October, early November, before the honeysuckle begins to senesce. However, that means begins to drop its leaves, because the foliar treatment won't work unless you've got leaves to spray it on. And on that point, if the vines are too diffuse and you've got leaf litter and not many leaves present, then your herbicide treatment is only going to have limited value. And perhaps by that point, after a first herbicide treatment, you've got a lot less honeysuckle on the forest floor. That's the time to go back and begin pulling it by hand. And that's basically been my primary activity for the last 2 to 3 months or so, was through beginning in December. Going back and completely killing off the honeysuckle and not allowing any more regrowth whatsoever. So consider that sequence. And mechanical treatment is very effective under those circumstances.
Nicola.
I think it was actually at this workshop last winter that someone mentioned that forestry mulching is a great way to tackle invasive trees without herbicide, because it tends to disrupt the plants. Besides the fact that they're chopped down to the ground and disappeared, it disrupts the root biomass with the vibrations, and they don't tend to resprout. So if you are on a larger scale than what Joe was talking about, you could consider a forestry mulcher. If it's not forest-based invasives, you can also just think about mowing. you might not get to eradication, but you might get to herbicide-free management, you know, where you just mow a certain area or weed whack it. I understand you might not get your mower, you know, down at the edge of your pond or into the woods or whatever, but there are ways to just mechanically manage the invasives. I think eradication can be very difficult without the use of some kind of chemical. And then there is an organic chemical that I know of called Burnout that I've had a lot of different people ask me to use. And it is great on annual plants that have a very weak root system. So it doesn't work on something like Atlantis or Johnson grass or Japanese honeysuckle, but it could work, and I've seen it work quite well on stilt grass. So just, there are products out there, but it's all very plant and site specific. That's all.
And the plants that you mentioned there, Nicola, would be treated in summer. And
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And not in winter where we are right now.
True.
Okay. So Tim Rod, are there any other questions that related to herbicides or control techniques that we can answer? I see there's still a lot of open questions.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of, I just noticed a comment come by the way, yeah, that I'd never considered before with regard to forest mulching, saying, hey, you're going to wipe out a lot of box turtles and other wildlife that's low to the ground. So be careful. Interesting point. Another question that came up is a person who she says she lives among people who believe there's absolutely no circumstance that justifies the use of an herbicide. Yeah, how do I answer these people?
Good question.
Yeah, I think you do mechanical control and you stop seed production as much as you can, and you do what you can. The phrase "pick your battles" comes to mind, and it's better to be friendly with your neighbors than to kill all the invasives, I think. So that's where I'd come out on that.
I just had a very good discussion with a client of ours who came with the roadblock of wanting a project done but didn't want to use herbicide, and we had a very good discussion. And kind of the quick thing here from my end is that the type of work that we're doing, and I'll frame it as ecosystem restoration. In the way that we as professional natural resource managers, all of the panelists here, are using the product as a tool is very directed under pretty regulated circumstances. You have to be a certified pesticide applicator in the state of Virginia. You have to follow the label, and we are all nature enthusiasts and lovers. And I would not do anything to the resource that I am trying to promote and protect as part of my job. I do have a problem with, herbicide being sprayed on an agricultural field 5 times and then that turning into my son's Cheerios. That I get it. But the way that we use the product in a very directed fashion, we're squirting a little bit onto a stump to kill an invasive plant to promote the native plants that are going to be coming up underneath it or that we're going to be replacing it with, I think has a lot of value and is a very effective way to reach our objectives. I would not do anything on someone else's property that I wouldn't do on my own property. So
that's a very good point, Brian. That's my take as well. Nicola?
Yeah, I've had some conversations with localities that I work in that are some of the board of supervisors maybe are anti-herbicide use on public lands. So we've had some in-depth conversations, but most people seem to respond well if I can explain that the aim is to get to a point without herbicides, that we actually kind of fundamentally agree, on the end point, but that you may have to use them for the first year or the first 2 years, like Brian said, in a very directed manner. Mm-hmm. But it can get you to the point where you both are happy with the ecosystem and it can be herbicide free and full of native plants. So I think explaining to people that this could be part of a short-term remedy, for long-term management. that seems to help.
Mhm.
And Beth, let
Yeah.
me just add one thing too, and that is that those of us who do use herbicides and are out there trying to work on invasive plants, suppress them, reduce their impact on the landscape and their tendency to overwhelm our natural heritage at the ground, at the shrub, and at the tree layer, at the canopy layer. We need to find or use a method that is commensurate with the scale of the problem and is practically efficacious. Those of us doing the work and have slogged away at any given on any given project using mechanical means only, know that these plants, which are invasive for a reason, they're extremely aggressive in their growth. They have nothing to slow them down in this ecosystem to impede their growth. Many of them are prolific seeders as well. And the seed bank for many of these things like stiltgrass will last for 5 to 7 years and even more in other species. So we're not enthusiastic users of herbicide. We just kind of get that we have to use them. They're required in order to make the kind of progress that we need to make to bring the ecosystem back into balance with a dominance of native plants over the exotics.
And if I can throw in another one, the amount of herbicide that I have used on my property is that decreasing for you guys, or is this decreasing? Has decreased over the 5 years because I had to use a lot because I had a lot of invasives, and now as I've eliminated them, is this right? Is it going this way? No, this way. My herbicide level has really decreased to very small amounts because there's not much left. So just that's something else to think about the future.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Nicola's short-term versus long-term approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. We are bumping up on 2:30, and I would just like to, if you have a question about herbicide or a question about invasive control techniques, I'd like to open the floor to a couple of 1 or 2 live questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, you may do so, and Carolyn will unmute you, and you can ask your question to the panel.
Okay, I've just unmuted Jim Gerlach, so go ahead and ask your question, Jim.
Jim, you may have to unmute yourself as well.
Still muted.
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead, Jim. Jim, we're not hearing your question.
We can come back to Jim, and I've unmuted Laura Clark, who would also like to ask a
Yes,
question.
Hi. Hi. I have some lower growing invasive bamboo. It's not the golden one that's super tall. And I've been reading about how it takes kind of 2 seasons to cut it down, let it grow a bit, and then hit it with an herbicide. And I was wondering, you guys have mentioned quite a few. What's good for the smaller growth bamboo? What would you recommend for that? And I'm in the Blue Ridge in Lynchburg.
We've treated bamboo at a lower stage once it's been cut, and as you alluded to, there's many varieties. But if you have a situation where you can foliar treat the smaller stems or the regrowth, usually late summer to September timeframe, and you usually have to use a pretty high concentration of glyphosate, like a 8, 9, 10% concentration. If it's near water, you're going to want to use an aquatic safe product like Rodeo.
I unmuted myself. So did they.
Okay. Anybody else have a thought about bamboo for Laura? Thanks, Brian. Jim, we'll go ahead and try to hear your question again. We heard you when you were unmuted and then you muted yourself.
My question was previously answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn, is there any?
Yes, I'm allowing Melinda's next in line. Melinda, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, we
great.
can.
And I know that boxwoods aren't native, but they're not invasive either. And I have a bunch of antique boxwoods on my property. And most of my invasives, the honeysuckle, the English ivy, are under the boxwoods. I've always worried about even a foliar treatment on the ivy or honeysuckle being brought down into the roots and hurting the boxwoods. Is that a problem?
Melinda, I've faced that situation a number of times, and my answer would be no. If it's Japanese honeysuckle that you're dealing with, I wouldn't do a foliar spray. You will kill the boxwood, but rather do a cut stump on as precise as possible, maybe using one of those tools that Joe mentioned about 10 minutes or so ago, a paintbrush or a dabber, rather than a squirt bottle, but being really precise with with the aiming of the herbicide on the cut stump of a honeysuckle vine that might be large enough to take the herbicide. That means, to me, that means probably 1/4 of an inch in diameter or more. If the stem of the honeysuckle is 1/4 of an inch or less, that vine is readily pullable. So it's a little bit of potentially back-breaking work. But again, cut everything at the base of the boxwood that's climbing, all the stiltgrass that's climbing into the boxwood, and then you could pull the small vines out and treat the larger vines with herbicide. And by the way, whether it's glyphosate, potentially with Triclopia, but definitely not glyphosate. It is not going to translocate through the soil and damage the roots, be taken up by the roots of the boxwood. Possibly with a Triclopia product, I have seen that. Nicola, Brian, you might have some experience there too.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I'm thinking if Melinda had me out to her property and I was looking at her fancy old boxwoods, I would probably just get something basic like a rake and try and get anything I could out from under the boxwoods. I would not try and apply herbicide near a valuable plant that someone wants to keep, just in case, and then treat the vines at the edge of the boxwood or further out from it and try and kind of create a border at the boxwood, so stop them invading.
Okay. Carolyn, why don't we go ahead and take one more question and then we'll move into our break.
Great.
Carolyn.
Carolyn Smith, you're free to ask your question.
Yeah. So right now I'm in the process of going after young autumn olive, maybe half an inch or an inch in diameter at most, using the cut stem method. So cutting it down close to the ground, dabbing with my Buckthorn Blaster, which I learned at a previous Prism workshop to use. And a lot of the days it's too cold to use an herbicide. So I'm wondering what your experience is, particularly those of you who've done this in the winter. What's the lowest temperature I can effectively use the herbicide? And then Nicola, you mentioned the window of time. We have to stop doing this in about 2 more weeks, 15th of February. When can we then resume? Is it June, July, after the growing season?
So I'll start answering, but I have a feeling that Joe and Brian might have more specific dates in mind. Mine is more by feel from being in the field. So I would think you stop your basal bark and cut stump treatment on woody plants closer to the start of April. But like that, spring is kind of coming earlier and earlier. And then I believe I would start back up again probably mid-June. And that's just kind of after the real spring, early summer flush of vegetation up into the trees. So I don't know, Joe or Brian, do you have more specific dates as you're more tree-based?
Yeah, with the shrubs, some are going to start leafing out earlier than others. So Multiflora Rose, you will start to see some of that leaf out in late February. And it's actually treatable with a foliar method in March. But with autumn olive, Caroline, what I would do is autumn olive can be a little bit early as well. Keep a close eye on the buds, and the bud of autumn olive will really start to swell as that sap is getting geared up to in the spring. I would use that as an indicator. Once you start to see the bud swell some, and you can really see those little tiny dots on the silvery shiny bud material, then I would probably stop and wait for the plant to be fully leafed out before you began your treatment again.
Nicola?
And also just to clarify, like there's no real harm in doing it, you know, all the way through till the end of June without taking a break. It's just you lose some of the efficiency or the mortality. But like if your only time that you have for some reason is April, and that's the only time you can get out, then I still think it's worthwhile going then. Just know that you would have a reduced impact.
William will give you the last word. And then
No, in April, I'm going after garlic mustard.
Fair enough.
So,
and put it in your salad.
Carolyn, if you're cutting off the autumn olive at ground level, unless the ground is solid frozen, which it's probably not going to be in Virginia for quite some time, and you're using your buckthorn blaster, as long as you keep the herbicide in the buckthorn blaster from freezing, you should be able to daub it on the cut stump, and you should have efficacy with that treatment.
Okay.
Oh, that's really good to know. So I can just put the buckthorn blaster in my armpit, keep it warm until I need to pull it out and
I would recommend your armpit, you know, but maybe in, you know, something that's not going to freeze. Just, you know.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Carolyn.
Thank you all. That was very helpful.
Thank you. All right. So for right now, we're going to take a break. We'll resume our discussion at 2:45. And when we come back, we will spend some time talking about your specific questions about particular species for winter control and some of the questions that you have about that. So go get yourself a cup of tea, a snack, bathroom, glass of wine if it's that time of the day for you. And we'll come back at 2:45. And in the meantime, I will put up our contact information as well for you all. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. All right, it's 2:46. So we'll go ahead and ask people to come back on, and we'll get started in just a second. I gotta shut. All right, is everyone ready to get started again?
Yeah, I've been having fun answering some questions
I
in the
know.
Q&A box.
Thank you to all the panelists for helping to tackle some of those.
There are tons of questions.
Yeah,
They are all worth talking about.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm just scrolling through them as well. Lots of good questions. And so I think we're going to also get some questions from raised hands. But so let's go ahead and get started again with our conversation and really dig into some specific treatments for specific invasive plants. And so we don't lose the question about lesser celandine. I think I'm gonna toss that one to Jim to get started if you'd like to talk about controlling lesser celandine.
Sure. I saw at least one question on lesser celandine came from Jen Souls in Arlington. And Jen is a natural resource specialist in Arlington County and working on invasives. And so I'm chagrined to hear that it's up already. Brian, perhaps have you noticed that lesser celandine is up as well in our area? I haven't looked yet, but the time is coming. And lesser celandine, for everybody who doesn't know, that's Ficaria verna is the botanical name for that. And you can look it up on the digital atlas to see what plant that is. It's particularly noxious in the Washington, D.C. area and region, Rock Creek Park, stream sheds in Arlington County, and perhaps in Alexandria, in Richmond, and now as well in Madison County and Greene County, and down through Albemarle and Charlottesville, and then down the James River. So it's a floodplain plant, and in the spring ephemeral, which greens up right about now, and then it's going to disappear below ground by May or so. And Jen, the recommended time frame for treatment is when roughly half of the plants are in flower, which would be usually somewhere in a March, late February, maybe early March timeframe, I suppose, depending on where you are in the landscape, mountains versus more coastal plainy or eastern Piedmont. But I have treated it earlier as well, and you'll get it. You'll get everything that is green. You'll kill everything that is green. I guess the risk of treating too early is that not all of the bulbils will have sprouted, and you won't get 100% treatment on any live plants that might send up their shoots after you've treated. So you could come back a second time after you've treated it once early. Brian, you have anything more to add on? There's a question on glyphosate versus triclopia. I should say or just on glyphosate. Glyphosate and a 2% mix in a backpack with the surfactant and dye is the method of choice by invasive plant control professionals. And I found that was the case too, because I began treating it in a field area when I was going through sort of a meadow on neighbors' properties, and I didn't want to kill the grass. So I wanted to use a triclopia product or a broadleaf herbicide that wouldn't kill the fescue in this field and leave brown holes in the field. So I tried triclopia first, and it didn't seem to work. And so came back in the second year and used glyphosate and expect that, and that's been the experience with professionals, is that is the go-to chemical to use.
There's there's a lot of people. Can everybody hear me? There seems to be an echo.
I got you, Brian.
Okay. There's a lot of folks in Richmond that are kind of chomping at the bit to get back after this plant right now. We'll probably wait a little bit longer, as Jim explained, to let more of that green up. But there's a lot of concern of this plant in a lot of the James River parks. But in terms of the specific herbicide to use, lesser celandine tends to grow in floodplains and can grow in wet bottomland areas, and so we need to be careful with the herbicide we're using. Make sure that if you use the glyphosate product, it's labeled for that area. Again, the Rodeo is the safer version of this. You also want to be careful with the surfactant, because the surfactant is really the problem in some of these wet areas. As a lot of naturalists know, a lot of the salamanders, the bistomide salamanders, are breeding in these this late winter, early spring rains when we might be treating the celandine. So we need to be cautious of that and make sure that we're using a surfactant that is labeled for those areas as well. As Jim alluded to, there's very little research out there that says anything except for glyphosate's use on this product. And it's a relatively new species in terms of treatment across a lot of professional areas. And so we've set up some treatment blocks down in Richmond where we're looking at Triclopia versus glyphosate's efficacy, but I don't have data for that to present yet.
Thanks, Brian. Just to elaborate a little further, we've been using the term surfactant, and I don't think we've explained it yet. And that's an additive that is added into a backpack sprayer along with the herbicide and along with water in the case of the glyphosate products that we're talking about. And as Brian indicated, it's the surfactant in a glyphosate product called Roundup that is toxic to aquatic animals and wildlife. So do not be using Roundup around standing water or flowing water, any marshy wet areas. And as Brian said, use Rodeo, which I think, Brian, it has a built-in surfactant that is aquatic safe.
It does not have a surfactant.
Okay, it doesn't. And so you can buy an additional surfactant. And the purpose of a surfactant is to enable the chemical, the glyphosate mixed in water at a very low concentration, at a 2% concentration, to stick to the leaf. And some surfactants are also, in addition to being what are called stickers, they're also penetrants, and they enable the herbicide to penetrate through the waxy cuticle of the leaf and enter into the system and kill the plant down into the root system. Again, look for an aquatic safe product, as Brian is saying.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate a word about herbicides, because in this part of the discussion, we will probably mention some brand names of herbicides or common names of herbicides. Anytime you're working with a herbicide, whether you get it at a farm store or you get it pre-mixed at Lowe's, always read the label, read where you should and should not use that herbicide, read how you should mix it, and also importantly, read about the safety requirements. Do you need special gloves? Do you need to wear glasses, eye protection, contact with skin? You always want to minimize all of the different ways that you can be exposed to the herbicide. So read the label. Often you will hear that the label is the law, and the label is the legal document that instructs how the herbicide is to be used. So always thinking about using herbicides safely, and it's important to read that label. So go ahead, Nicola.
And one thing to add on surfactants, I hear a lot of people, they just want to add a surfactant like for every use of the herbicide and a dye. And just to caution that most plants, I would say, don't require a surfactant for the herbicide to be effective. So something like cattails absolutely does, because they're so waxy that the herbicide will just run off it. So you do need something to make it stick or penetrate the leaves. But most, like your stiltgrass or some of the other plants that we'd be working on, I don't believe they need a surfactant. And as I am a constant kind of questioner of the data that's being put out about herbicide safety and everything else, I would say the less things we're adding to our tank and putting out in the environment, probably the better for safety.
So Jen and anybody else who answered that or asked the lesser celandine question, hope that Brian and I got that for you, answered that for you.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I'm gonna throw it to Tim and Rod to maybe give us some questions about treating particular species that are coming from the Q&A box.
We have a lot of questions about Creeping Charlie. If
Okay.
anybody wants to take that one on.
Anything specific?
Just how to get rid of it.
How to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Who'd like to tackle that one? No takers. Oh, we got Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, I love to treat Creeping Charlie when I find it, kind of diffuse around our property in connection with these other species that are green in winter too, English ivy and vinca, and that goes for chickweed, common chickweed as well. For chickweed or for chickweed and for ground ivy or creeping Charlie, you can use a 2% glyphosate product, and I think that that Triclopia will work just as well if you're working around grasses in winter, and you don't want to harm any or ferns in particular. You don't want to damage them. You can use a 2% concentration if you're working with English ivy and with vinca as well. Those are more difficult to penetrate waxy leaves, and so you're going to want to bump up the concentration of glyphosate maybe to about 3.5 or 4%, and you'll probably you will need to use a penetrant surfactant with those plants, and that's a good suite of 4 or so green plants that are vulnerable to an herbicide spray on the ground in winter.
I have a question on lesser celandine is whether is foliar spray the only option, or is there an option to manually remove it?
Manual removal is problematic at best. If you found one plant or 2 plants or a very small colony, you might be able to dig out all of the bulbils. You might need to go there with a sort of a coarse filter and dig it up with the clump with a shovel, and then sort of filter the dirt out and leave the bulbils in your screen filter. The bulbils are small, and they're down to sometimes 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and it's hard, and there can be dozens of them growing out or spreading out of an initial bulbil that's fueling that green plant. So that's why herbicide for an infestation of any scale whatsoever is going to be absolutely necessary. Brian, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree. That's a pervasive plant, and I see it almost be enhanced with mowing and creeping into yards, and I think herbicide is probably the best route.
Yeah.
Another interesting question, which is if you're doing cut stump treatment, near a waterway, pond or lake or stream, so you're cutting the woody plant and painting the cut face with concentrated herbicide. Do you need to use an aquatic approved herbicide in that case?
I think you should always use an aquatic safe herbicide if you're kind of coming up with that question. So the general rule is like if your feet are standing on wet soil, you should be using an aquatic safe herbicide. But if you, for some reason, don't know, maybe it's wet sometimes and dry other times, I think you can err on the side of caution and just use the aquatic safe herbicide.
And then there's a question about, what about prescribed burns?
I knew this one would come up. Joe, would you like to field this question?
Yeah, we get that question a lot about prescribed fire to control invasives. And the short answer is that it's not going to. Fire is a maintenance tool, and you tend to get more of what you've got when you use fire. I also see a lot of sites when landowners ask about this that just are not going to burn, and the litter layer is too thin. It's not gonna, the fire won't carry well, and if it does, it won't be hot enough to really have any effect on the plants. A lot of species, or some species that you want to, that are present and you want to control, you can't control with a winter prescribed burn, like Japanese stiltgrass. That's often a lot of the fuel on some of these winter burns, and you're not doing anything whatsoever to it because the stems are all dead and the seeds all safely on the ground.
And the research.
But that said, fire.
The research on that, Joe.
I'm sorry.
So the research on that, Joe, is that fire actually boosts stiltgrass. You're actually fertilizing.
Yes.
Actually fertilizing stiltgrass seed.
Yep, and so fire, while it's not going to control your invasives, it might play into like an overall scheme, an overall management scheme of how to attack them, such as if you have a burnable site, then the fire may remove a bunch of debris, burn up some of the dead vines that are there, make the live ones easier to find. It could top kill some things so that it might top kill the vines that are alive, and then you'll have to come back and spray sprouts, but at least now it's all on the ground. With Japanese stiltgrass, yep, when you burn it, you will get an awful lot of it the following year, but that might be what would, those seeds are all in the seed bank, and they're in the seed bank whether you burn it or not. So by burning it and getting, you might get 2 or 3 years worth of seed expressing all at once, instead of having to wait for 2 or 3 years. And you get all that up at once, and you can herbicide it or treat it then during the following growing season, and you get a few years through the seed bank in one season. So it might be something that can play into, work into your overall management scheme, but fire is not going to control your invasives.
All right, good, thank you. Rod, would you like to find another question for us to answer?
Sure. So somebody asked a question about Triclopia 4. Is it okay to use diesel instead of basal oil?
Good question.
Right.
So diesel's been the go-to penetrant for farmers for decades. But I would, so it's usable, but I would not recommend it. Because with basal bark, you're using a lot of the product more so than doing cut stump or hack and squirt. And so in a 3-gallon backpack, if you're doing the percentage, you've got gallons of diesel fuel that you're spraying out into the environment. So while it's a little bit more expensive, a labeled basal oil product is probably a better thing to use.
And you'll run across old literature or even current literature that still suggests diesel as a carrier oil. And again, that's not the best option.
The last time I looked, that was listed as an option on the label to dilute it
Yeah,
in
yeah,
for a
I
lot of
think
those.
so.
So it's there, but I'm with Brian. I'd recommend you use the horticultural oil.
Yeah, Nicola?
And just to say that you're never to use diesel in a wetland or an aquatic setting. So, you know, even if you're using diesel, against Brian's advice on your dry land, don't ever use it where there's water, because it just spreads very quickly. So.
And if I'm just going to throw something out there, mosquito abatement. I spent many years in California. Diesel was the go-to thing to kill larvae and pupae in wetlands and marshes for decades. So yeah, don't use it.
Wow.
Now that we're back to talking about herbicides again, we had several questions about use of herbicides nearby wells and wellheads, near livestock, and their effects potentially on mycorrhizae.
So not to get into really in-depth chemistry on a lot of the products, but we've mostly been talking about a pretty narrow spectrum of products to use in invasive species management. And of those that we've talked about, glyphosate, triclopia, these are products that don't really have a lot or any soil activity. They bind really well to our clay soils, so they do not go down into the soil far at all. That's different in the northern Shenandoah Valley, where you start getting into some karst topography, or as you move down into the coastal plain, where you start getting sandier soils. But here, where our soils are pretty thick clay, those products stop, they don't move, they begin to break down almost immediately. So dangers to wells, at least if we're talking about a 100, 200, 300 foot drilled well, are probably pretty minimal. If you get your water from a spring, I wouldn't treat invasives with herbicide around your spring. And with livestock or with animals of any kind, it's always the safe bet to just exclude the animals until the product is at least dry, if most labels say 24 to 48 hours. However, if you go to your local co-op, which is a farmer-centered store, you're going to find products that have no restrictions on grazing. They will say that on the label, whether they do or they don't. So that means you can spray that field for broadleafs and the cows can go right back on it. I would just say, as a general rule of thumb, keep your livestock or your dog or pets out of your treatment area at the very minimum until the product is dry, if not a day or two.
Nicola.
It was a VDAX training I was at regarding wells and spraying, and they said the same thing as Brian, like the herbicide is not going to translocate 200 or 300 feet through soil, but they put one caveat that you're not to be spraying herbicide up against like the top of your well housing, on the off chance it could run down the actual well housing, which is not going through the soil, but just running down a metal or PVC pipe. So they suggested you stay 5 or 10 feet back from your wellhead with your herbicides, just out of immense caution, so as you don't put it in your own water supply.
Agreed. Also about agricultural use, there are groups of products labeled specifically for forest use, others that are labeled for agricultural use. And if you're going to be doing any of this on ag fields or adjacent to ag fields, then make sure you're using a product that's labeled for that and you follow the instructions on that, like we've been talking about. But that might be different than your neighbor or your friend who only has forest land that they're working in, and they might use a different product.
Okay. All right, I did see that there were a few questions about Multiflora Rose. Would anybody like to share some of the best approaches to treating Multiflora Rose during the winter or maybe very early spring?
I can start.
Okay.
So Multiflora is a very unkind plant to work with. It's even worse than like your average greenbrier or blackberry. Its thorns are really sharp, grab a hold, and they leave a mark. And I've lost a couple of jackets to Multiflora Rose. So it can get really tall and really big. And I think the winter is a great time to remember that you can get a solid weed whacker head and you can, chop the heck out of it. and then come back when it leaves out and you're dealing with a much smaller problem below your knees. So just as one approach that you could start on in the winter that makes it at least accessible, because some of these patches are so large. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that was the specific question. One of them that I saw, it sounded like they had a cut stumping and basal bark were not really feasible given the number of
And
stems.
if you've
Oh,
got
yeah.
if you've got a real big an infestation, like I had, I got my tractor, I've got my bush hog, my little rotary mower behind. I would back up into a stand of Multiflora Rose, raise the mower, and then drop it down on there. So instead of having literally 10, 15-foot canes hanging over, it's all down to ground level. And then when you come back the next year, or if I wanted to go back and do some cut stump, I could, because Multiflora Rose, if you're not that familiar with it, you can have a bunch of stems maybe only this big, but they'll cover 20 feet, an area 20 feet because they grow so big. So getting rid of all that volume of stems, really, you'll see you'll have very few actual stems in the ground, but you could have a huge amount of thorns waiting for you.
With that bush hog method, William, I think you're pretty brutal with that poor plant. Really.
Well, I apologize after I do it.
You need to have some mercy there.
He apologizes and then he herbicides it. So
which is
Multiflora Rose.
Go ahead, Joe.
Go ahead, Joe, please.
Multiflora Rose is one plant that you can control through repeated cutting more effectively than some of the others. Autumn olive and tree of heaven are woody plants that don't respond well to repeat. Well, they don't get controlled well by repeated cutting. But Multiflora Rose, if it's in a field setting and something that can get bush hogged or something like that, once it's down, if it's cut a couple of times a year, after a few years, it'll give up. So that is one that you can do without herbicides with some persistence.
Okay.
And it's an early, it leaves out relatively early, and so we've had success with treating this plant with a foliar application in March, before a lot of the native plants are starting to come out again. And it's also one of the shrubs that things like goats love to eat. So if we haven't mentioned goats, or briefly mentioned goats, goats are an option, but in the winter, they're only going to be eating the species that are leafed out, English ivy and Multiflora Rose in the early spring, late winter. But just to make a caveat on that the goats are going to defoliate the plant, but the plant will probably leaf back out again. So additional applications are going to be necessary.
Thank you. Let's see. So I think at this point, why don't we go ahead and take some questions live from the audience? And so if you have specific questions about controlling specific invasive species during the winter, throw them at us. And Carolyn, can you get us started?
Yeah, I'm going to allow Christian. Off you go.
So my question is I am able to farm on a property that is just a field, and it's been the field for years and years, and it's covered in poison ivy and Multiflora Rose. All of those, both of those are all through it, but my goal is to be certified naturally homegrown farmer, and so I don't want to put any chemicals on that area. So how do I get rid of the poison ivy and the Multiflora Rose? Any tips?
What are you going to be farming?
I am a cherry tomato farmer for the CSA of Fredericksburg, and I will also be a cut flower farmer.
So will you be plowing or disking or
well, that was my
cultivating
question.
Okay.
My question was, is the best option to plow it, or because my plan, I'm allowed to weed tarp it. I mean, with weed fabric, I'm allowed to use that white woven fabric. They did allow me to use that. So my plan was to use that, but I didn't know if I needed to do something before that.
How big of an area?
Less than an acre, about 300 feet. A football sized area. Football sized field.
I would assume you plow and then put the weed fabric down as quickly as possible.
Okay.
But Brian, I don't know if you have a different idea.
Yeah, you'll have to plow and disc that to mechanically control some of those species, and you may have to do that a few times. But that makes sense if you need to do that anyway to begin to plant your crops. Going back to the goats, if you had a little bit of time to wait, the goats in the spectrum of grazers, goats really prefer those broadleaf, brushy species. Sheep are kind of in the middle, and then cows are much more on the grass side of things. And so you could bring in the goats if the area is fenced, or put in a temporary fence and let them graze away, where they'll target mostly that poison ivy and the multiflora. You might have to do that a few times or rotate them around as you put in your tomatoes. So there's a couple of options there.
And you can try and use some kind of vinegar solution or acidic solution on the leaves of the plants, and it will help reduce them a little. It won't eradicate the roots. But once you have it mostly under control, that could be one thing you could do to stop yourself getting poison ivy all the time.
That's a great idea. I probably use the vinegar option at this point because I don't have goats, but thank you for that idea. Thank you so much for your help.
Thank you.
Gina, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, I was hoping that you folks could address what carrier oils you use for applying Triclopia herbicides, and if you vary that depending on what the target plant is. Thanks.
So if you're working on kind of small scale, so you don't need gallons and gallons and gallons, you can just get a gallon of mineral oil at most farm stores. And that has no smell and is fairly safe in the environment. So that's one option that's easy to come by. Brian?
We order through a company that supplies various herbicides. The specific company that we work with is Trinity Turf, but there's various ones around the state that you can work with, and we get a basal oil or a horticultural oil that is specifically designed for this basal bark application, and it has a red dye that's already pre-mixed, and that works for just about all the woody thin bark species that we're tackling. There are some ready-to-use mixed products that you could order from forestry suppliers. Everything is ready to go. It's already got the herbicide, the carrier oil, and I think a blue dye mixed in. I'm blanking on the name of that product. I believe it's called Pathfinder. Yeah, Pathfinder. And you can order that through forestry suppliers, which is a big catalog company.
And then just to say, some of those ready to use, they call them RTU, which is obvious once you know what the name is, but I didn't know what an RTU was for a while, so it was a rather confusing acronym. But they tend to be safer for like the general public. If you're going to be using it, you don't have training, you're not certified, but they're already pre-mixed, so it stops you maybe slopping some chemical around on your feet or on your lawn or the floor of your garage or wherever else you decide to mix your chemicals. So the ready-to-use ones can be a great way for you to avoid contact with the chemical.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thanks for that question. Carolyn, take another.
We have a question.
Don't have any other questions at this stage through raising a hand, but we do have quite a few in our chat box. And one is regarding Tree of Heaven in a horse field. and trying to get rid of it, but she's reluctant to use a herbicide that might hurt the horse. Any suggestions?
Brian already it kind of covered that with letting animals into areas you treated. Most herbicides will be okay once they've dried on the leaves, but definitely get something that's labeled for use in an agricultural setting with livestock, and follow the instructions for that. I would ask that person also to go to their extension office and talk to their extension agent about that. We don't have an extension agent on this panel, but they are a great resource for agricultural settings and herbicides to use there and things like that.
Yeah, you finding your extension agent is wonderful. I found mine. She came out a few times to the property, talked to me about different things. And if you're treating ailanthus now, there's no leaves, so you're not doing a foliar spray. So I'm thinking hack and squirt would be fine. The horses are not going to go up and licking the cut wounds in the side of an ailanthus stump or tree. Or if it's small enough to, well, here's the thing. If you care where it falls, then you want to drop it where you want to drop it. If you kill it in place, then it'll just fall naturally, you know, any which direction. So you have to be careful that if you're going to kill it, if it falls naturally, it's not going to hurt anything, a fence, property, and all that. Horse, exactly. Yes, we're talking about horses.
So I think the tree of heaven in that horse field is a great place for a cut stump treatment. And I don't know that a horse would chew on a tree of heaven. Can't imagine that tastes very good, but I've seen them chew bark on plenty of trees. So I think that's a good place to get that thing cut down and herbicide the stump.
Okay. We have a question from Henry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Carolyn, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So like the lady who was talking about growing cherry tomatoes, I recently purchased a property here in Winchester, Virginia. It's a pasture field on a hillside, and it was recommended to me that if I wanted to do anything productive with it, which I do, I should plow it up. And it also had various honey locusts and autumn olive trees on it. And so I took my tractor and my grapple and I pulled a lot of those suckers out, and some of the cedars as well. But unfortunately, there are roots that still exist. I'm sure you're aware that those roots sometimes can be 20 or 30 feet long. And so somebody asked, what would you plant? I'm hoping to plant some bloody butcher corn. And I'm just wondering what I might expect in the way of those roots coming back.
So did you do that this winter?
It's done. So I've planted it with a cover crop, but there are still plenty of roots sticking out of the ground.
Yeah, you can expect those roots to start growing stems and leaves on see, what were the plants you named? They were the autumn olive, and definitely will root sprout from just about every broken root where they broke off. So you can expect that to sprout. Are you planning on harvesting and selling that cover crop?
No, the cover crop will be probably crimped. And then, like I said, I'd like to plant bloody butcher corn.
Okay, so
doing
overall, I think I'd suggest planning on spending this year still killing the plants that you want to get rid of out of there and not planting your commercial crop until next year. Let all of those things come up, resprout, express themselves, and herbicide them and kill them, and then plant your corn or whatever other crop you're going to plant in 2022.
So it was suggested that this is supposed to be a no-till operation, and I'm new and totally inexperienced with it. But it is suggested that in addition to crimping the cover crop to kill it, to kill the stems, that I may very well have to use an herbicide. Otherwise, I'm going to have a weed patch along with my corn. So if I'm going to have to use an herbicide this year, then would I be able to go ahead and plant a crop and roll the dice?
So I would consult with a crop specialist on that. But corn is probably one of the #1 crops that is oversprayed to control weeds. So they have genetically made corn to be Roundup resistant so that it can be sprayed. Now, the variety you're planting probably isn't, but I would probably direct that question to an agricultural farming expert. But there will be some methods for you to selectively spray autumn olive and other broadleaf weeds while not damaging your corn, if that's the direction that you want to go.
Thank you. I had talked to the agricultural agent in the area here, Bobby Clark, and he had suggested not Roundup or glyphosate, but a couple of milder herbicides, because Bloody Butcher is an heirloom corn, so it's not it hasn't been genetically altered. So it was interesting. You considered autumn olive along with weeds. So just because the root's on the ground, it becomes more of a weed, rather than.
I think that's weed, as in a plant that you don't want growing there. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Hey, Tim, did you have some questions from the Q&A?
Yeah, there have been some questions about five-leaf Akebia, which is a little bit unusual for a vine, and it is very, very, very thin vine with a lot of vegetation for it. So it's not like the thicker vine ones where it's pretty clear that you're going to use cut stump or something like that. So what do people recommend for five-leaf Akebia?
Five-leaf Akebia is another one, somewhat like Japanese honeysuckle, that is totally deciduous, or it stays green and susceptible well into the winter until we get some really hard freezing temperatures. And so that's one that we've treated on a few places. It's an interesting plant. It seems to pop up in a lot of these really old estates, and then a few other places. I think it was a popular, Thomas Jefferson era plant to pass around here in the Commonwealth. But cutting the vines down so that they're not climbing over shrubs or up trees with a weed eater with a more robust head or loppers, and then getting it down and then treating that with a foliar application of Triclopia, 2%, 2 to 3% of the Triclopia 3. You ought to be able to treat that well into the winter when a lot of the native vegetation is dormant.
Yeah, Brian, I was on a walk in Montpelier about a month and a half or so ago, and saw this big standalone patch of five-leaf Akebia on the way to that short-leaf pine stand that I think you all might have planted some 5 or 10 years or so ago. And I thought of you. And it was bright green into December and just begging for treatment.
We treated a lot of Akebia at Montpelier, but there was still plenty left out there.
Yeah, there's plenty at Monticello as well. Another question that we've been getting has to do with, after we've done our removal work, what native plants should we be looking at reintroducing?
Yeah, we could go ahead and start kind of a restoration native plant discussion at this point. Nicola,
Beth?
Jim?
Yeah, before you go there, we haven't talked at all about garlic mustard.
We haven't.
Which I think one of us may have mentioned it. Maybe somebody said they'll be going after it. But I do want to note that is a plant that is in rosette form right now. And I failed to mention it half an hour or so ago when I talked about that suite of species on the ground, including English ivy and vinca and chickweed, et cetera, and ground ivy too, those 4. You can certainly go after garlic mustard this time of year and then all the way through. I think that was Carolyn Smith, I think, who said she'd be spending her April going after garlic mustard. You can begin that now, and all the way through February and into March. When you're moving into April, it's getting a little bit late in the game. You're taking a risk that the plants will begin to bolt, flower, and then you're kind of running up against an emergency there, needing to either herbicide the plant or pull the plant and bag them before they begin to fruit and set seed. So that's a plant that's all over the landscape, and my guess would be that 3/4 of the folks on this Zoom call run into it either on their lands or lands where they're doing volunteer work. Go for it.
Yeah. And what, Jim, could you speak to what is the best herbicide for garlic mustard?
I found that glyphosate works best, and even better, unfortunately, than Triclopia, which I might want to use when even this time of year when there are green ferns on the ground, or rosettes like the Arabis or Beckera species. I'm forgetting their common names. I apologize. Or rockcress, smooth rockcress rosettes that are out there. They're plentiful on our 100+ acres of forest. And you get as well as the ranunculus species too. They are evergreen through the winter too, as well as the fern species. So they're vulnerable to glyphosate. So I wanted to use a broadleaf herbicide and Triclopia and try to hold those good native plants harmless. But I'm finding that Triclopia is not as effective on garlic mustard as I had hoped.
Nicola?
So we've talked a lot about herbicides, but garlic mustard is one, even on larger scale, that I encourage people not to herbicide, only because it requires kind of more of a blanket spraying approach. So it does have, like Jim was saying, it does have an impact on anything else that's around. It's an annual plant. So if you can pull it and get your 6 best friends to come over and bribe them with whatever it is, coffee or wine or whatever it is you need to do, it's not hard work. It's not thorny. It's usually not unpleasant. And I think with a bit of diligence and time, you could get garlic mustard under control without the use of herbicides.
And my own response to that, Nicola, I'm sure you would agree, it really is, again, it's just a question of scale.
Yeah, and you could lose your friends.
And you could lose your friends, right? Right.
Yeah, don't get your best friends to do that.
I've wanted to recruit friends for that, but I'm talking here about dozens of acres.
Yeah, I'm just saying. So
and also more diffuse populations than carpets.
Yeah, I've just encouraged landowners that at the right time of year, anytime you're out walking, just pick the garlic mustard, right? Absolutely. So anytime you see it, anytime you can. But yeah, absolutely, different scales maybe.
Can you talk about disposal?
Yeah, once the plant has bolted, and once you I would say once you have set seed, which it sets from the bottom of the flower stalk up, and the seed pod in a mustard family plant is called a silique, and it's a long sort of thin cylinder that extends out from the vertical raceme of the inflorescence. And once you see one of those, the herbicide is not going to act quickly enough, I think, to prevent seed set. So then you have to pull it, and you need to bag the inflorescence at a minimum. You can cut the inflorescence at the bottom below the lowest seed pod or silique, and then pull the rest of the plant out of the ground. If you don't pull the rest of the plant out of the ground, you risk another inflorescence being sent up and plant continuing to go to seed, a couple of weeks to a month later. So that's my recommendation. Make sure that you've got the whole inflorescence and you bag that as soon as you see seed set.
Rod?
Yeah.
Can I add one little thing to that, which is that, if you're going to bag it and carry it out, the root clump is kind of heavy, and it's not going to. You can cut that off and leave it. Is the point? All you have to do is take the stalk. You don't have to take the root.
Actually, Tim, that's precisely why I mentioned that. Yeah, I'm glad you made that explicit. Because when I'm half a mile from home base, I can't carry that much weight. And so I'm just cutting the inflorescence and bagging that, leaving the rest, the heavy part of the plant on the ground, which it's my experience is not going to reroot. I might knock all the soil off the roots, off the root ball, just as an extra measure of vengeance on the plant. But it's for the most part, it's not going to reroot. Yep.
Okay. Hey, Rod, did you have something to add?
I've got a couple other things not related to garlic mustard per se that I just wanted to throw in.
Yeah, please.
One is we've had a lot of questions around vines, and I want to reiterate to people that what they should not do is attempt to pull the vines out of the trees. That's really, really dangerous. You can dislodge dead branches. The vines can weigh a lot. The answer is once you cut them off and do the cut and paint, kill the vines, just leave them hanging in the tree to come down later. Let Mother Nature do that. So that's one. Another
It's
one
dangerous and also completely unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're doing cut and paint, where you're going to cut off a woody plant and then paint the concentrated herbicide, one of the things to remember is you can't wait. In other words, some people think they can go along and do a whole bunch of cutting and then come back and paint. The answer is if you wait more than a couple of minutes, it scabs over and the herbicide will not be absorbed into the plant. So you can't come back and paint it later. You got to do it on a timely basis. Several people have asked about pictures for some of the plants we're talking about. Recommend that you actually come to one of our workshops in March, where we do lots and lots of pictures on Zoom about both identification and control. And then we had a question about someone who's got lots of deer browsing, and if you're using herbicides on things on the ground for ground ivy and vinca and other things, is there anything you can do to protect the deer from eating it?
Apparently nothing comes to mind right off the bat for any of us. Probably the best thing to do with the deer is wait until fall and harvest the deer. That will actually help with your overall invasive species control program, because deer preferentially browse the native plants, which actually, now that I'm talking about that, deer tend to avoid all of these non-native plants, with a couple of exceptions. And like deer will stand in a field of Japanese silkgrass and starve to death. They just will not eat it. So but they really, really like the natives. That's what they eat. So when you are able to harvest the deer and reduce the deer population, you'll help the native plants by not hurting them. The natives will be able to grow without being repeatedly browsed and cut, and they'll slowly be able to get back up and better compete with the non-natives. So wait until fall when deer season is legal and shoot the deer.
Very good. Also had a couple of questions from people who have neighbors with stands of bamboo, and they can't get the neighbors to treat the bamboo, but the bamboo is coming underground onto their property. What's the best thing that they can do?
I'm going to throw something out there. Since you don't want to foliar spray if they're all green, because it's, you might hit some of your neighbor's stuff. I'm thinking cut stump, cut it down. There's a whole procedure to where you're supposed to cut the culms of the bamboo and then pour in or spray in a little bit of herbicide either in the cup or on the edge and kill them on your side. I mean, they're on your side. I think you're totally legally allowed to kill any plants that are coming on your side that you didn't plant there. But anybody else has something else to say?
If it's an area that you can mow, once you get the bamboo down to ground level, you could just be diligent about mowing it, and then, you know, it'll keep popping up, but it'll be mowable. So that would be my suggestion.
A bamboo lawn.
It'd be fantastic. No, but I've seen people have good success gaining ground, you know, a few feet a year on bamboo in pushing it back, just using a mower. So,
But you won't eliminate it because it'll just keep sprouting.
Yeah, but if it's on your neighbor's property, that's where it came from, and your neighbor isn't going to do anything about it. It's all growing off of one root system, and you're not going to be able to kill the entire thing, the entire organism on your neighbor's property. You can certainly herbicide that on your own property. I think you could also start with like some kind of deep plow or a ripper to break up the root system near the property line, so that you have a separate organism on your property that's broken off from that, but it's going to keep invading. So
there's a way that you could attempt to dig a trench along that line where the bamboo is invading. So after you've treated the encroaching stems on your side, if your neighbor is kind of unwilling, or they really want their bamboo there, this could be an opportunity to educate them. But if that's the case, then there are some techniques that I've seen that you can put a physical barrier in the ground that will stop those roots from moving further towards your lawn. But I would maybe try Googling some of that to see which fabrics or techniques are best. But there are some physical barriers that I know that have been attempted.
I know somebody, Brian, who dug a 2-foot trench and poured concrete down it. And I'm not sure what the result was, but that was one method. I go in a slightly different direction, to the policy and political direction, and note that it's probably the most effective method, since the plant is not going to die on your neighbor's side, is to contact your board of supervisors or your city council at the city or the county level, because localities are passing ordinances now. City of Harrisonburg being one of them. Loudoun County is I think investigating this right now to see whether they. Well, as I said, Harrisonburg has one already, and I think some other jurisdictions too. But Loudoun County is exploring putting in place an ordinance on bamboo.
Specifically on bamboo.
Yes.
Okay, then good to know.
Beth, I'm going to allow Jill, she's had a hand up for a while, allow her to talk. So Jill, did you want to ask your question? Jill Barker?
Oh, hello. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I didn't know you meant me. I kind of forgot I had my hand up. I was the one who asked about the 5-leaved Akebia, and it's in a park in Arlington that also has sensitive wetlands. We tried hand pulling it. We got it all off the trees, and then we tried hand pulling it, which took 6 people 2 hours to do a 6 by 8 foot section because it's so infested. So then we bush hogged it and got a rototiller, and it took 2 hours to do an 8 by 12 section. So I think we're just left with having to do the herbicide, even though it's in a wetlands. It's not right next to the wetlands, but it is in the vicinity. So any advice?
Jill, you're in Arlington?
Yes.
What park are you talking about?
Upton Hill.
And you've got clearance from Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority or from the county to either use herbicide or run a bush hog?
That's not my question.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So let's go down a different route then. Sorry for this presence in Upton Hill. You might get in touch with Rod Simmons, vegetation ecologist for the city of Alexandria, who's directed its control in an Alexandria park. and it's in the Holmes Run watershed. I forgot the name of the little natural area that it was in, but it was a very impressive infestation covering a good, I'd say, half an acre.
Oh, okay.
It was huge, and that infestation is gone.
Great.
So get in touch with Rod.
Thank you. Will do.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm still working on getting the permission, so.
And you've already run a bush hog with no permission. I love it.
No, I've got permission for that part.
Oh my God, that's great. Yeah.
All right. So I'd like to take, we still have some questions about specific species that we haven't answered. So I'd like to take a couple more questions about that. Rod or Tim, are there anything in particular in the Q&A?
We've had questions like, where can I find information on how to identify vines in the winter? So how do I learn which is which when there's no leaves on them?
Mm-hmm.
There was, I don't know if that's the case any longer, it depends on where you are. If you're in the DC region, the USDA graduate school offered a class for a number of years on identifying woody plants in winter.
Department of Forestry has a winter tree ID book, and a separate book for vines, vines and shrubs. I don't know if that one specifically addresses it in winter, but there aren't all that many vines in Virginia. There aren't very many woody vines. So I mean, there's, especially the common ones, there's 6 or 8, maybe 10 really common, probably 8 really common ones. So I'd suggest you find out what those are and kind of approach it that way. You can identify Oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, grape, English ivy, then you'll be able to identify 80% of what you walk around and see in your woods, at least.
In Virginia as well, I might add, if you're close to or in an area where there is a master naturalist chapter, you've got a lot of botanical enthusiasts and some botanical botany specialists as well who might be working with those master naturalist chapters who could orient you to those species, help you ID them.
Nicola?
And better yet, call your local forester if they can, especially if it's forest land, if you can have them out to look at that and help you with it. And if they can't come out for that for some reason, then email them a picture.
The U.S. Forest Service has a publication. It's a brown book called the Invasive Plants of Southeastern United States. That's I'm going to butcher that, and maybe.
I was about to say, this one is the Mid-Atlantic. That's the Forest Service.
Yeah, there's a Mid-Atlantic one, and I think there's a link possibly on the Prism site to the Forest Service one that is really good for identification.
Mm-hmm. There is, yeah, and we'll send out a publication with that, the link to the document you're talking about.
Yeah, it's called A Field Guide for the Identification of Invasive Plants in Southern Forests.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, thanks, Rod.
And another way to do this is next month, we have 3 different workshops at different times.
Yeah.
The 18th, the 27th, and the 31st of March. And in those workshops, half of it is ID, is identification. The other half is treatment. And we will show you photos till you get tired of looking at photos.
That's it, William.
Yeah.
Here's the book. It's not available in print anymore, I don't think, but it's a free downloadable PDF. Highly recommended. And then its companion volume is the management guide. So one is all about identification, and this is all about control. 2 great books. And I wish they would reprint them again, because there's a lot of need for them.
Actually, they're updating them, but they don't reprint them, so that it's only download at this point.
Okay, so I would like to just spend a few minutes to talk about restoration and native plants. And I recall that I saw a question about What do you plant after an infestation of Japanese stonecrop? So I thought maybe I would hand this one off to Nicola to start, and we'll go to maybe about 5 minutes on this topic.
Okay. In that you said that was specifically for stiltgrass?
Yeah, but yeah, you could talk generally about that as well.
Well, restoration is a huge topic, right? We could do a whole afternoon just on restoration. So I'm not going to sit here and give you a list of plants for your site because I don't know your site. So I think the best thing any of us can do is, you know, if you're lucky enough to own land or manage land, is I get to know it. I do that through just walking, right? All seasons, every week, just go walk a different part of your property, get a map of it or a Google Earth image and start drawing it out into different parcels or naming it or just understanding it as opposed to it being one whole mass. Any landscape will have different bits of personality. So wet or dry or steep or high or low, whatever it is, you don't have to know any technical words, right? You can start describing your own property. So I would do that first. And within that description, you will see you have some problem areas, probably the edge of forests or old ag fields, or somewhere that's been disturbed. And you may have some areas right next door that have not been disturbed. And you can start identifying what plants are there. Like what are your kind of reference sites on your own land, what exists or what you like, what you want more of. So I think that's a good place to start for anybody's site is like, yeah, what do you like and what do you want on your land? What does your neighbor have that you wish you had? So get yourself a plant identification app. I use Seek and iNaturalist on my phone. I also have the Flora Virginia app on my phone. And that just helps me remember the details of plants that I don't work with very often. So I think, first off, if you're tackling invasive species, you need to get them to a manageable level, while at the same time considering what you're going to put back onto the landscape. So for stiltgrass, for example, I am working on a site now that has a full carpet of stiltgrass for about 2 acres of forest, and the forest was about 30% mature ailanthus trees. So in taking out the ailanthus, we actually increased the daylight and disturbed the soil. So we kind of made the stiltgrass problem worse. So we will be planting into that area, planting only non-grass species. So ferns, flowers, and sedge species. So I can treat with a grass-specific herbicide and kill the stiltgrass while allowing some other things to take root. All right.
And I just want to point out, I've shared my screen with you all, and that has a few resources that can be helpful when you want to learn more about using natives and thinking about what is that next step after I've been implementing an invasive control program on my property. What is the next step, to start putting some natives back in the landscape? There could already be quite a few things that are still in the seed bank, and once you remove the invasive species, they will be allowed to express themselves at that point. But some good resources, the Commonwealth of Virginia's, their Virginia Natural Communities book that's published by Natural Heritage, and it does a deeper dive into the native plant communities that are in Virginia, and it can help you to learn about what kinds of native plants are around your house or on your land. The other resource that is good is the Digital Atlas of Virginia Flora, and that can tell you if a plant is native to your county. And you can see on the example I have shared, there's a bunch of red dots, and that will tell you that it's native to your county, this particular plant, or if it's introduced, or if we're uncertain about its origins. And then the last site that I really like to promote is plantvirginianatives.org. And that has a whole bunch of different resources based on your region. The Virginia Native campaigns, there is a campaign for the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives. There's a NOVA campaign. If you go to the website, you'll see, and it'll tell you, like, if you look and you can see what county, and it'll tell you belong in that campaign. And basically it's a bunch of native plants resources that are specifically tailored for your region. There are free native plant guides that are available for PDF download at that website too. So a lot of great resources on that page. And again, we'll be sending out some follow-up information, and these resources will be on that. Would anybody else like to take a couple minutes to speak about restoration or native species after invasives?
Yeah, I might just reiterate that it's pretty important to get the invasive situation under control, because sometimes you treat one thing and you end up with another, as Nicola's example said. And typically we go into these larger scale invasive situations, and we have a 3-year kind of minimum outlook of when we start with a really big dense patch of multiple invasives. We usually try to give ourselves a 3-year minimum to get that to a point where then we can really start thinking about spending some money to put some native vegetation either back or enhance that somehow. There are multiple ways to replant depending on scale. Obviously, you can't go out and buy 3 5-gallon pots to reforest a 100-acre invasive situation. That would not be cost prohibitive, but you could maybe try some seed. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of great seed resources that you can get pounds and pounds and pounds of seed, especially for forest interiors. Joe and I were having a discussion about this. How do we go in and remove a lot of invasives in a forested setting, but then repopulate the understory, especially the herbaceous layer? And there just aren't a lot of good resources for seed, particularly for a lot of those forest understory plants. But starting to frost seed like this time of year, if you've gotten a lot of the invasives under control and you want to start repopulating that in a cost-effective way, buying some seed and starting to broadcast that this time of year, and then using freezing and snows and rainfall to help get that into the soil can kind of jumpstart some of those efforts. And then moving down in the scale with smaller projects, there's a lot more availability of plants in the plug size. You might spend $1, $2 a plug. And then of course, buying bare root seedlings. You can get bare root seedlings from the Department of Forestry's nursery supplies. There's 2 nurseries in the state. The main one is in Augusta County, and you can start putting bare root seedlings of a variety of native shrubs and trees that they have back into some of these areas.
And for seed source, I've used Ernst Seeds a few times. It's ERNST. They've got collections of seeds for different habitats. It's really rather phenomenal what they could do, and they can make custom mixes for you, or you can get. I got the Northern Virginia Piedmont wildflower mix. It's very specific, and they're all raised or grown sort of local. It's not like you're getting, Russian sage from somewhere. They're all local seeds, which I highly recommend them.
Okay. Well, with
I
that,
mentioned.
go ahead,
mention-
Jim, briefly.
Yeah, I'm just mentioned here. Well, first, just to riff off of William, Ernst is a good provider, and they also include for example, their Northern Piedmont seed mix, plants that are not native to the Northern Virginia Piedmont, but might be from the Midwest, a couple. So for any of the mixes that you do get from Ernst, make sure you take their list and go to the Virginia Digital Atlas and see whether or not all those species are native to the region, to the Piedmont, or to the mountains or the coastal plain, wherever you are. And even better, see whether they're native to your particular county. So I have some experience with Ernst, but in general, good. But you need to look closely also. And then this is also a good time to put in a plug for the plugs, as Brian mentioned, of native plants provided by Earth Sangha, which is probably at least in our area of Virginia, probably the largest provider of locally and regionally native plants. And I've done a fair amount of replanting in forested sections of our property. And as Brian said, since the seed of most plants in forested understories largely is not available, but it's available in plug form from Earth Sangha. I've been buying a fair amount of plugs of, I would say, anywhere from 15 to 20 particular species that I know they're either already present and I have observed them on our property, or there's a red dot for the digital atlas on Greene County, Virginia, where our property is located, or I've observed that plant, within a mile or 2 miles or 5 miles in a similar habitat in Greene or Albemarle or in Madison County. And so I'll be buying, 50 or 100 plugs, something like that, at a couple dollars a plug, and planting them in the understory. These are trying to get forbs going on a depauperate or species poor landscape that's been used hard by farmers. We had grazing going on for years, and farmers or of our landscape sort of crowed about how 50 years or so ago this particular set of acres was absolutely clean. Well, it wasn't clean of the invasive seed bank, and with the forest grown up after 40, 50 years, all those invasives were there. So it was probably it's been a 5-7 year process of taking out one species after another, and then getting it to a point. I'm thinking of a particular 6-acre area, getting that 6-acre area clean enough to be planting those native forbs and grasses. And I love Nicola's strategy with the stiltgrass infested area of replanting with forbs, which gives her the opportunity to control stiltgrass with a grass-specific herbicide. The only situation that I know of where that doesn't work would be in an aquatic or a wet area, because at least all the grass-specific herbicides that I know of are oil-based and can't be used around water. But anyway, that's a non-aquatic setting with a stiltgrass infestation. That's a great and creative approach.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have one last thought, Nicola, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Well, it's just to answer that, if it was an aquatic setting for stiltgrass specifically, which is not winter, you can use a really low, like 0.5% of a glyphosate aquatic safe product, and it will only kill really weak species. So it may brown out some of the forb leaves, but they are strong enough in the root biomass. They'll stay going, and it could preferentially kill something like stiltgrass. So that's another approach.
Right.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to have to go ahead and wrap up our discussion. So I'm going to share a final slide with you all. But I want to take the time to say thank you to each of our panelists. First, I want to thank Rod, Tim, and Carolyn for helping with this event. And I also want to thank William, Joe, Nicola, Brian, and Jim for sharing all of their expertise and helping to answer all of your questions today. So thank you to everyone, and thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. I also want to mention that Blue Ridge Prism is supported by the Virginia Environmental Endowment and donors like you, and you can make a donation at our website, blueridgeprism.org/donate. And also, if we didn't answer a question for you today, please feel free to reach out to us, info@blueridgeprism.org. And you can also go to our Facebook page for any updates and to ask us questions. And lastly, I want to say upon leaving the Zoom webinar, you will be asked to answer some questions with our survey, and you will not see the survey until you click the leave button. So let us know how we did. And with that, we'll go ahead and end our meeting today. And I will ask the panelists to stay on after the call. And so this meeting is adjourned. Thank you for joining us today.
Nicola, you've been asked to show the progress on your hat.
Yes.
I can. It's been pretty good.
I don't know who asked that, but maybe they're still on the call.
All right.
All right. So it's not very much progress, is it? So it's the first bit of the hat. So anyway.